welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my first official YouTube recorded video, I guess. Usually I go live in a sewing group called Sew Whatever. I created the group about a year and a half ago because somebody had an issue with one of their sewing patterns, and so I went live to show them kind of my tips and tricks, what worked for me, what helped, and it just kind of grew from there. We've had a lot of fun making videos. This is my cat Benjamin. I have two cats, but he really enjoys being on camera as well as watching me sew. Don't you? Do you like it? You don't want to talk to me now? It's fine. Anyway, so in this video I will be making the Bonnie bucket bag. This is a sewing pattern by Swoon Sewing Patterns. Her patterns are fantastic. I love the way they're written. They're really easy for beginners, for intermediate, for advanced. You can make them any way you want, basically. They're awesome. So there is a link below. You can click that. It is an affiliate link, so I make a very small portion when you purchase through that link, and it's just the pattern designer's way of saying thank you for getting other people to purchase it. The hardware that I will be using is 1-inch swivel clasps. This isn't in the pattern. I just thought I would kind of have fun with it, making it look a little more luxurious. I'll be using two 1-inch D-rings. I'll be using one 18mm snap, and then I'll also be using two zippers. The pattern does have a zippered top, but you don't have to make it with a zippered top, and I personally don't like the zippered top. I think it closes really weird. Not a fan, but feel free to try it. So to start with, and if I go out of order, I do apologize. I don't have the pattern in front of me. I've just made this so many times that I know how to make it. So there are two of these pieces that you'll cut mirrored to each other. I'm using leather and a recycled t-shirt for my outer fabric. It does have a bit of a curve to it, so you're going to want the curved section toward the outside, and then this, the lowered curve facing each other. So it's a 1/2-inch seam allowance pretty much for all of her pattern pieces unless otherwise stated. And if you have a seam guide, you'll want to follow as closely as possible. So I'm just going to go straight down 1/2 inch. I'm using a stitch length of about 3.5. And then you can actually just kind of push that through and leave your threads long, and then start on the other side. Bye, Ben. So after that, you'll want to open up your pattern or your main panels, and what you want to do is open this seam. This is actually called a butterfly seam when you open it like this. And if you can iron this down. Since I'm using leather, that's definitely not an option. You can use double-sided tape if that is your prerogative. You want to get a little help leaving it open, but what I'm going to do is just kind of feel underneath with my finger to open up that seam. I'm going to start on the leather side, and I'm going to change my stitch length to a 5. This stitch is definitely more for show than anything else. Just want to follow as closely down as possible, and then I'm using my hands to just open up that seam. And then sew along the other side. Okay. So that's what that'll look like. And here it is from the back. You can see that seam is opened. As far as interfacing, I did not put any interfacing on the leather. I wanted it to have a little bit of a slouchy feel to it. And then the other side, I used woven fuse and an interfacing called Decaville Light. These are both available from gotinterfacing.com. And again, I'll link that below. If you haven't already subscribed, feel free to do so. That is also below. It's actually kind of like before all of the links, so I mean, you may as well hit it like while you're making your way down there, right? Okay, so I'm just repeating those last steps. Going down one side. Okay, so this pattern calls for a zippered panel on the outside. This is totally optional. I do not want to add the panel on the outside, but you could actually add like a large slip pocket to the outside if you wanted, and you could use either the exterior fabric or the leather or vinyl you decided to use. I've done that before and it looks amazing, it's stunning, would recommend. It also calls for a decorative panel along the bottom. Because I'm using leather, I'm gonna go ahead and skip that step as well. It just gets way too bulky really quickly. So I do apologize if you came here to get some help with that. I'm gonna go ahead and add a nameplate to the outside of the bag. I ordered these from a maker in China, and they do have my brand name on them. If you're looking for something that's a little more affordable, I do sell nameplates through my website that say handcrafted. I have them in 5 different metal finishes that match hardware that I sell as well. So if you are interested, feel free to check that out. I'm gonna go ahead and add this 4 inches from the bottom. I just feel like that's where I want to add it. Okay. I have this Tula Pink seam ripper that is perfect for poking holes in fabric very safely, since it's like a scalpel. And then from the back side, add our washer and push it securely down. So there is the nameplate attached. Nice and centered, looks cool there. So that's the exterior mostly done. I know I skipped a lot of the important steps, but they just weren't important to me. So now I can work on the lining. I decided to use my exterior fabric on the curved top shape, just so when you like look inside, you see that instead of the rest of the lining. I don't know, I'm weird. I will be adding 2 zippered pockets, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that really quickly. Switch your stitch length back to like a 4 or a 3 if you want. So I'm gonna fold the lining panel in half. The lining panel, you want to make sure that you have the wider version or the wider portion towards the bottom. It's a bit of a trapezoidal shape, so you want to watch out for that. And then grab one of my zippered pockets and fold that in half, kind of the opposite way. You'll want your wrong sides facing each other. So just like that. Yep. You can clip that in place. For the lining of this bag, I am using a waterproof canvas. I love using waterproof canvas because it does not require any interfacing at all. Unless you're adding a snap or something like that, then you'll definitely want to interface. But it works great without. So we're gonna grab our zipper template. This is from buypiera.com. I'll link that below as well. And I'm gonna use the 7-inch little opening because I'm gonna add a 7-inch zipper. And then the way I make a zippered pocket is I just sew 2 parallel lines. You want to make sure that they are roughly the same shape and backstitch at the start and the beginning, of course. We're gonna cut through the center, and then when you get to about 1/2 inch from the end, you kind of go out in a V shape. And I will show you guys what that looks like. So you'll cut it like that. You can see the little V's at the end and straight down the center. So we'll unclip it, turn it through, and then I'm gonna press it with an iron. With waterproof canvas, you can only iron the right side of the fabric. If you iron the wrong side, it kind of starts to melt in a weird way, and you definitely do not want that. So I'm grabbing a 7-inch zipper, and I'm using a really pretty navy blue to kind of match the exterior fabric. And I am adding 2 zippered pockets just because I feel my customer that I'm making this bag for will really enjoy having 2 pockets, but you could add just a single pocket, or you could add a sectioned slip pocket inside. There's all different kinds of pockets that you could add to a bag, and you really just want to keep in mind your customer or even yourself on what kind of pocket you like. Trim your excess, trim the excess, and then I'm gonna fold it up, kind of even out the top of the pocket and add a clip, and then I'm going to cut the bottom of the pocket open. You only need to do this for 1 pocket inside your bag, and you can use this method on absolutely any bag. I promise once you try it, it'll blow your mind. Well, maybe. It depends. Okay, so I'm going to clip it, and then clip the thread, and I'm going to just fold this up about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, whatever works. And this just helps you later on to sew that opening closed. Okay. So that pocket is added, and now I want to grab the top portion of my lining, and you want to take those straight sides and match them up. So you can see this piece has a bit of a curve to it and then a straight bottom. So you want to line up the straight bottoms of the two lining pieces and leave the curve to the top. And using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew those together. Hope we don't run out of bobbin thread. It's going to happen though. And of course I only have white. All right, and then I like to fold this up and top stitch through. You could fold it down and top stitch through. It just depends on, it really does give it a little bit different of an appearance. Yeah, I'm gonna fold it up because I want a little more structure to the top. And then switch it to a longer stitch length. For top stitching, you could use a 4.5 or a 5 stitch length. All about personal preference. So I'm gonna leave this zippered pocket open because this is the one we want to birth the bag through. So you can see it's completely open. So I'm gonna set that aside. And I'm going to work on the other zippered pocket. Okay, so I've got my piece folded in half. I'm gonna open it, and then we're gonna fold this piece in half in the opposite direction. And this folding method just kind of helps you get your zipper pocket nice and centered. And then I'm going to grab that zipper template again, and I just use a regular ballpoint pen. And we're going to use the 7 inch by 1/2 inch zipper piece. And this pattern, template is great. It has a little center notch that you just line it up and trace. It takes all of the thought process out of measuring your zipper pockets. So I'm a huge fan. Okay. Making my stitch length shorter again. You want to be a 3.5 or so. Back stitching, and then I just lift up, back stitch. And you just want to make sure those lines are as parallel as possible. If you prefer sewing a full box around, you totally can. This just works for me, so I do it. Same method, cutting down the center until we get about 1/2 inch to the other side, and then angle out your snipping. And you want to snip right next to the threads. You do not want to sew through the threads. Hopefully that makes sense. So snipping right next to them but not through them, and then turn it through. And then I'm going to press it from the right side. Using a little bit of steam, that'll help get your zipper pocket nice and crisp. Get rid of those puckers or wrinkling. I'm going to grab another zipper. I always like to iron my zippers. If you're using a metal zipper, just be really careful that you don't touch it, because you will burn your hand if your zipper's too hot. If we're using a plastic zipper, definitely use a pressing cloth and low heat, because it will melt. Most zippers are nylon coil, in which case you're good. Probably. I've had some cases with red zippers, surprisingly enough, where they've melted a little bit. If your zipper is a little longer, it's not a problem. You just want to kind of move it to where you're not going to sew through the zipper ends. So if you need to move your zipper to one side or the other and just cut off the extra, it'll still hold up, no problem. Okay, so we'll snip that. If you're worried you didn't catch all of your zipper tape, feel free to take a look from the wrong side. You can zip it and unzip it a few times just to make sure everything is secure. And then I'm gonna leave this zipper pocket zipped. We're just gonna fold this up and sew in a U shape, starting from one side, going along the top, and then finishing on the other side. Back stitch, go up, around, and back down. And then trim your excess threads. And then we're going to repeat the last step, or that step, where we sew the top of the lining piece on. And instead of sewing pins, I like to use these little hair clips. They're available from pretty much any beauty supply store. They are single-pronged alligator clips. And as you can see, they just kind of slide right off. You don't have to unclip them, versus Wonder clips, which hold a lot more securely, which is good for most cases, but not what I need at the moment. So leaving this seam facing up, I'm just gonna fold this over and top stitch. Okay, clip the excess. So you're probably wondering, like, well, how is this bag going to close? I am gonna use a magnetic snap. I have plenty of interfacing that it should all hold up just fine. Snap back. So you want to grab your magnetic snap washer and line up this center with the center mark. So I can still see my center fold, and then about 1/2 inch from the center of the top of the recessed panel, you just kind of want to line that up and make the 2 parallel marked lines. Go, lay down. And then using my Tula Pink seam ripper, I'm just gonna make my little holes to feed the zipper through, or the magnetic snap. Attaching your snap, you're good to go. So that is what it'll look like. I love how the coral of the lining pops against that. So then you're going to repeat that with your other lining piece. And if you've lost your center fold, you can just, find it again, fold this in half, make a crease, and then about 1/2 inch from the top, maybe 3/4 of an inch, just kind of line your snap up, mark out those parallel lines, and stab through. You definitely want to make sure you're using enough interfacing underneath the snap. You might be able to add like a little bit of fusible fleece underneath, which I think I'm going to do, especially for the actual magnetic part, because this is going to get pulled on a lot. So I'm just going to go to my scrap interfacing bin and grab a piece. because those prongs can start to pull through the fabric after a few months. So I've added the fleece, and then I just pull those prongs down. So that's really all it takes. And then you can iron it down if you need to. Steam, what have you. So then what I like to do is snap your magnetic snaps together and then clip the sides. So you want to line up your side panels, or the top lining panels, I'm sorry. Make sure they line up nicely. And then I'm going to sew straight down and then straight down the other side. You want to leave the bottom open because we still have to, you know, add the bottom. So one trick to make sure your linings aren't too saggy inside your bag is to start at a 1/2 inch seam allowance while you're at the top, and then work your way to a wider seam allowance. Not too much wider, but just a little bit. So you can see it's just barely noticeable, but it's 1/2 inch here, and then I went a little bit wider. Ben notices it. Did you notice, Ben? He's like, no, I didn't. Okay, so flipping it around, starting with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then going a little bit wider. And then you can trim your seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, personal preference. And then we're gonna add the round bottom. So this gets really complicated. I remember the first time I made this, I was like, how are we supposed to sew a round bottom on? You just want to make sure you find your centers first. So we already know what the centers here are, but we want to bring those together and make center snips into the center of our lining panels along the bottom. So we found our 4 corners, if you will. We've got our side seams and then the center of the main lining portions. So we're gonna do the same thing with the round bottom. We're gonna fold it in half, hot dog style, so long ways, and make little tiny snips. If you don't feel comfortable snipping your fabric, you can also make little like permanent marker marks or something. And then we're gonna fold it in half, hamburger style, I guess, whatever. And make little snips. So you can see here, I've just made a little tiny snip, nothing much, but we've made 4 of them. So with our right sides together, we're just gonna start clipping those snips. So clip that center, clip that center, clip that center. And I don't use the hair clips for this part because they don't clip as strongly as these Wonder clips do. These Wonder clips are honestly probably not actually Wonder clips. They sell them on Amazon for $100 for like $9, which is amazing. So then you just kind of start pinching the curves together and adding clips. If your bottom panel is too big, you'll have these really big creases and things won't line up. So you want to make sure that you cut your pieces as close to the pattern as possible. I love using plastic templates that I get from topsandbobbins.com. They're amazing. amazing. They're a little pricey, but if you make tons and tons of these bags, they're totally worth it. Otherwise, you can use plastic cutting mats from the dollar store. You can get like 3 of them in a pack, and then just trace your patterns on that, cut them, you're good to go. So here is our bottom panel. I've got all these clips added. It looks like a really nice secure fit. There's no major puckering or wrinkles that I have to worry about. So what you can do if you're new to curves is grab your stapler. If you don't have a stapler, run to Target or the dollar store, get a stapler. I got this little tiny one at Office Depot. It doesn't have to be tiny, but this actually works. And then you just want to, about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, add some staples, especially along the curves, because these are always the hardest to keep together. You don't need to go crazy, but you can if you want to, if you're like, God, I just hate these curves. But I usually add 2 or 3 to each curve. I don't always do this on my lining anymore, but I definitely do it on my exterior because things will shift and it gets annoying. So as you can see, I added the staples. They're not too far in because you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you want to make sure it's not within, it's not further in than about 1/4 of an inch, because you want to be able to cut it out nice and easy or remove it very easily without messing up your fabric. So I'm going to start in the center or so, and use about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can go a little bit more, just so your lining isn't too big for your bag, for the outside to fit all together. So I'm going to use a 3.5 seam or stitch length so that it's nice and secure. And hope I don't run out of bobbin thread. Then you just want to hold those layers together and just kind of pull it away from your machine while it's also pulling it. I don't know, it's something you learn to feel. There we go. And now we can just cut away those staples and the excess seam allowance. If you want to make sure your bag is nice and secure, you could sew another row of stitching into the seam allowance. So if you did a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you could do like a 3/8 inch seam allowance in another row of stitching. It's up to you. I'm using a really thick thread, so I'm not worried about it. But that is your lining all finished. Your bottom is attached. So what you want to do is you want to flip it right side out. You're probably thinking this is not what the pattern tells me to do. Just do it, you'll thank me. And you can also check to make sure you didn't miss any seams. So there is our lining all finished, and I'm just going to set that aside and we can finish our exterior. I'll just sew the side panels together. I have a feeling I'm going to run out of bobbin thread soon. So you want to match up your top curves. I have mine upside down. Okay. So you want to make sure the straight sides are together and the curved sides are together. I cannot stress this enough. So the bottom is the flat side and the curved side is the top side. If you cut this pattern out correctly, you should have the outside fabrics on opposite ends. But if you didn't want that, then what you would do is you would cut out two separate pieces. So you cut out, that sounded confusing. Let's take a step back. So the way to cut this pattern out is you have one piece and you cut it with the pattern, flip it over or mirror it and cut out another piece or your other pieces. So if you want them on the same sides, let's say you wanted the leathers to be on the same side of the bag, quadrant I should say, then you would cut them out mirrored. And if you want them to be like this, you do not cut them out mirrored. So you'd cut out two of the exact same for one fabric and then you would flip it over. So now what we're going to do is using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and a small stitch length, 3.5 or 4. We're just going to sew the sides together. Alright, so now we are going to add our bottom panel. For the bottom of this bag, I used Decaville Light and Decaville Heavy. Again, these are available from gotinterfacing.com. I cannot recommend these enough. If you've used Peltex, you know that it starts to get wrinkly, it's hard to turn, it's so hard to fuse. I remember the first time I made a bag with it, I literally cried because I couldn't get it to fuse. And it was just a nightmare. Eventually, I did become friends with Peltex, but if I had to choose one or the other, I would definitely like marry Decaville and kill Peltex. Just saying. So I've marked out my centers. I already have my centers marked this way from when I traced out the pattern. So again, make sure you know what the bottom side is. I usually add these little triangle or arrow indicators to the top of my bag just so I know, because I still mess it up and I've made this bag so many times. And I even wrote bottom. Bottom. But if you're gonna write on your interfacing, please make sure that your customer isn't gonna see it. I mean, or do. That's your prerogative. Okay, so I'm lining up those centers. I am not trimming my excess seam allowance yet. I want to give this bag a little more stability, so I'm leaving it. Because it can actually act as like a bit of a spine for the bag. If you wanted to go extra fancy, you could even open up this seam like you did the front panels. You could open it up and do the butterfly stitch on opposite sides. I'm not going to do that on this bag, mostly because I already have this halfway attached. Hi Ben, what are you doing? Where are you going? Are you leaving me? Okay, so the centers are clipped and you just kind of want to pinch it in place. And if you've cut this all out accurately and you've cut your Peltex and fused it accurately, it should fit just perfectly into place. You've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance between your Peltex and the edge of your bottom fabric, so use that. When I first started making bags, I had this problem constantly. Like, the bottom doesn't fit. What did I do wrong? Well, you cut your Peltex too big, you fused it unevenly off center, all that good stuff. And it still happens, but now I know that you can just kind of cut away your Peltex. And just be careful about it, of course. Okay, so now that we have that all clipped, again, I'm going to staple. This is not as easy with leather, but it does tend to shift a lot, so the staple does what it can. So again, I'm just gonna add 3 or so to each corner. If you're worried about it, you could staple the whole bottom of the bag, you know? You're gonna cut it out anyway, so it's not a big deal. Okay, one more. All right, so bottom of the bag, nice and stapled, ready to go. So I'm gonna switch my stitch length to a 4 because I am sewing through a lot of leather. If you use too small of a stitch length, you're gonna perforate, leave holes. It's not gonna be good. So I like to start with a side longer piece, and you're just gonna sew right next to that Peltex. You do not wanna sew through it if you can help it. You just wanna just barely kiss it, just right next to it. So I'll zoom in and try and show you guys what I mean. Hold on. Hopefully that worked. Let's see if I can lower the camera. Sorry if it gets shaky. There we go. I'm just gonna sew next to it. And then when you get to these corners, you're gonna have a little bit of trouble, but those staples are gonna help keep everything in place. You just wanna turn slowly. And then when you need to rearrange your fabric, please make sure you leave your needle in and just kind of lift up your presser foot and readjust. Set back down. Leave your needle in. And what I'm doing is just back stitching over the butterfly stitch, because when I trim my seam allowance, I don't want that to become unsecured. Okay, so we're just rearranging a little. Leave your needle in the fabric. And then this is an example of sewing twice around the bottom. You can see I've come out just a little bit from my original seam allowance. And honestly, I'm just kind of doing this to see if I'm gonna run out of bobbin thread, because I don't want to start working on my strap to run out. Back to the beginning. So there is the bottom of our bag. And now if you don't want to cut out your seam allowance, you can use a little pair of snips to just kind of go through and pull that staple out. You could also use a staple remover, but I found that this works great, and then it's another tool that I don't need sitting around. sure you throw those in the trash can because you do not want to step on that or have an animal eat them, etc. Again, you can pull these out with your hand too, but it's not as easy. And then once you have all those removed, you are going to trim down your seam allowance, and then we're going to add the strap connector pieces. If you use leather like me, you might want to use a sharper pair of scissors because it can be a lot to cut through. Welcome back, Ben. So now the bottom of our bag is attached. And if you just want to make sure that you've caught everything, nothing looks awful, you can turn your bag right side out or just give a peek from the bottom side or from the top on the inside. It looks good to me. So I'm gonna get started on these side strap connectors. Usually you sew them, go on Ben, go to your spot. Go on, go on, get out of the way, get out of the way, get out of the way. Sorry guys. Yeah, lay down, lay down, lay down. So I'm gonna use my double-sided tape. I purchased this through waywack.com. Go down. Just adding a strip to the center. And then I'm gonna fold my raw edges in. I've cut this piece to 8 inches long. I wanna have some fun with it. I wanna make it a really unique side connector. But you have to make sure that your machine can sew through this many layers. And this is a Juki DU 1181N. I'm using a size 19 needle with Tex 92 bonded polyester thread from Superior Threads, and I know it can handle the layers. Okay, so sides are in. This is going to be about a 1-inch connector, and I have these awesome 1-inch D-rings. So what I want to do is I want it to be, so you can see this is really long. I kind of want it to hang off the bag, but I can't. Let's see, so I'm gonna open this side. I guess I can't have it hang off the bag. Darn. That's okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little bit of double-sided tape again through the middle, and then I'm gonna cut yet another piece so I can stick it to the bag. So I'm gonna put this one down the middle. Fold that in half and in half. Make sure those sides butt up really nicely together. And then I'm going to add this over top, like that. So I'm gonna unpeel it, and then starting about an inch from the top, I'm gonna lay it over that side seam. You want to make sure that it is actually the correct side of your bag. You don't want to sew it through the middle, center, you know, the front. Okay, so centered over 1 inch from the side. Oh yeah, that's gonna look so classy. So, like so. And we're just gonna use a 4.5. I want it to be really secure, but also not like too small of a stitch length. We're just gonna go over really carefully. Don't wanna hurt the leather at all. Again, make sure it's centered over that side panel. Otherwise, you know, you worked really hard to get that to look really nice and then it didn't. I have a walking foot sewing machine which has a really rough bottomed foot, so I'm just using a scrap piece of fabric over the back of the foot so that I don't hurt the leather where that hardware is. We're just gonna go down one side, make the corner, and turn it. Nice and slow. And I actually like to backstitch at my corners. Just think it adds a little more security. Then I'm gonna backstitch again, and then I'm gonna go to the middle of this connector. Just kind of eyeball it. And I'm gonna sew down the center. You could add rivets if you wanted to, but I'm not going to be able to rivet through this much fabric. And backstitch. So that added even more security to this connector, and it looks badass, if I do say so myself. Okay. So there is what that looks like attached to the bag. That's fancy. Another thing you could do actually is if you wanted to add a connector that goes all the way across this seam, you would do that before you attach the bottom of the bag, and then you could add like rivets all the way up the side of it. Just make it flashy and unique. It's one of the reasons I'm still so in love with making handbags, is because you can do so many different things and make it feel like a different bag every time. So I've added a piece of double-sided tape to the center and just folding it in. And then this might sound crazy, but I like to give myself a really long piece underneath the top of the D-ring or connector or what have you. If you only leave a little bit, that's more risk that your connector, your threads are gonna come loose over time. Not immediately, but you know, in a year, year and a half, they could start to come loose. And if it's at the top of that bag, it's gonna be more likely it breaks even faster. So with it being all the way down there, we're giving it a longer lifespan, and it's just even more secure. So if you can, try that out. Okay, so I'm adding a piece of double-sided tape. I'm gonna peel it off. Again, this piece, for these side connectors, if you want them to look like this, I cut it 2 inches wide by 8 inches long for each piece. Okay, so that's my front. We don't want to sew it to the front. We want to make sure we add it to our side panel. Guys, we are almost done with this bag. This is such a quick bag. I love making Bonnie. All right, so 1 inch from the top. No more, no less. Definitely not less, because you've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then you have to top stitch. Like, save yourself. Okay, so we're just gonna center this 1 inch down. got this really handy 1-inch wide ruler that helps me with things like this, as well as good eyes. I hope. Okay. So make sure you open that side seam as best you can, and we're gonna start attaching. Side seam, open up. All right. Oh, not centered. Again, make sure you center it. It's very important. People will notice. Okay. There you go. Back stitch, back stitch, back stitch. Okay, and then we're gonna turn it. Thread got a little messed up there. Okay. So if I were to just set my foot down and start sewing, the back here would just tear it up because of the height difference. So that's why I take a little scrap piece of vinyl, leather, whatever, and then continue sewing. And then we're getting close to the corner, so just leave your needle in and start turning. Back stitch, leave the needle in, turn, or pivot as we like to say. Back stitch, straight up the top, back stitch, turn it. And then I'm going to protect myself. We're going to go to the center. And sew straight down. Oh, that looks so cool. And then if you have any extra threads, you want to snip them. If you have a lighter, especially if you're using like a bonded polyester thread or whatever, you can actually use your lighter very, very carefully just to singe those threads. Some people use like a wax to seal their threads. I don't know what that's about, but that's cool. So I've got a thread there. Snip and just really carefully singe the ends. All right, you guys, we are ready to add our lining. I'm excited. Oh, that's not where that goes, but whatever. So you have your exterior wrong side out, and then you put your lining right side in. Most patterns say to do the opposite, but your lining is usually smaller, so why wouldn't you put the smaller inside the bigger? You know what I mean? Just makes sense. So we're going to open up our side seams. Again, make sure you have your side seams with your side seams and the front seams with nothing. Not saying I've done it, but you never know. So, and you just want to slowly clip around the top opening. If your lining is too big, it's going to be really bunchy, and if it's too small, your outside's going to be too bunchy. So you want to make sure it's a nice fit and you've got the same seam allowance throughout the whole thing. Okay, so we're just going to add clips. Don't be afraid to add as many clips as you want. Want to make sure it all fits nicely. And it is a very nice fit. So you can see that with my lining and the interfacings I've chosen, this bag does stand up on its own pretty nicely, and that is because of the waterproof canvas and without interfacing. Like, it's a nice thickness, it's amazing. So I'm gonna start at my side connector. I'm using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're just gonna sew around the entire top. Make sure your hardware is out of the way. If you hit your needle with that D-ring, it's not going to be pretty. You could poke your eye out. You just never know. And then if you have to lift up your foot and readjust, please make sure you leave your needle in the fabric. Some sewing machines have an automatic needle positioner, which is great. It sounds like I ran out of bobbin thread. Yep. Not fun, but that is okay. Of course I don't have a black bobbin made, so we're gonna make a bobbin really quick. Usually you want to do this before you start your sewing project. But it's best to run out in a seam allowance where it's not going to be seen. At least it wasn't on a handle or anything like that. Whoops, got my bobbin. So I have this industrial bobbin winder. It's from Gold Star Tool. It's a New Tech bobbin winder. Sorry about that. I had some technical difficulty, but bobbins are wound and we're ready to finish the bag. So if your bobbin runs out while you're top stitching something, you just want to kind of start right over top, about a centimeter or 3/4 of an inch. Those are two completely different measurements, but whatever works for you. Just slightly off from where you started and back stitch and start again. I usually don't have issues with that. Okay, and then I'm getting close to where we started. Just kind of back stitch. And now the pattern says you want to trim down your seam allowances. I don't love doing that. It just gives your stitches a chance to break free, and we don't really want that. So what I'm going to do now is birth the bag. And so we want to grab our lining. We left this hole open. If you're smart, you left your zipper open. And what I do is I kind of fold the bottom like a taco and start pulling it through that opening. Using a 9-inch zipper is usually the easiest. Of course, if you can add like a bigger zipper, it's even more to birth through, which is awesome. I recommend not using a metal zipper for this step because those metal teeth definitely have a tendency to bite and rip fabric. Okay, so we're pulling it through pretty easy, and then you want to make sure you push out your bottom, get that seam nicely pressed outward. You can see our bottom looks nice. I love the texture of this leather. It's just soft and gorgeous and metallic. I'm into it. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna stick our lining back inside the bag, all the way down. Leave that lining pocket that has the bottom hole out for a minute. What I wanna do is push everything down and get it clipped. Make sure we don't have any issues, nothing else we need to touch up before we top stitch and then close that opening. Oh, this bag is beautimous. It's beautimous. Beautiful to the maximum. So I'm not seeing any issues whatsoever. So before I top stitch, I'm going to push this back in. If you didn't press your birthing pocket under 1/2 inch, you'll have to fold it in and press carefully, but I like to just have that step already done. And then you're gonna sew that close with a small seam allowance, or with a small stitch length. I will never get those two right, so don't hold your breath. I like to add a little woven tag to this seam, just a little final signature. And then you're done. The other nice thing about this waterproof canvas is it is a little bit flame retardant, flame resistant, if you will. So I have no problem kind of singeing those ends. Easy peasy, and then you can stick that pocket back in and zip it up. Sorry, just pushing that pocket down. Gets really thick after you fold over the corners. And then we'll zip it up. And again, I just like to press my lining into all the corners so that they sit nicely. Go ahead and snap it closed if you want, just to make sure that your bag sits pretty. This bag is so pretty. So you can see it looks a little different without the bottom accent piece, but it just gets way too thick if you're using leather. So I opted out. And then there is that magnetic snap closure. Nice little bucket bag. Everything looks good. We're ready to top stitch. I'm keeping it on a 4.5 just because I don't like too wide of a top stitch. I like to start on a side seam. It's a little inconspicuous. It's gonna get hidden under that D-ring. And just start back stitch. And go nice and slow. Make sure you don't have the underside caught under your bag. And then leave your needle in if you're readjusting. Sew through the other side of the fabric. Okay. And now we're ready to make the handle and attach it to the bag. Again, I'm just burning the ends of the thread so they don't start to fray at any point. Snapper closed. Just gonna set it over there for a minute. Oh, she's so pretty. Okay, so I'm going to make my shoulder strap. My 1/4 inch wide basting leather tape, and I'm gonna go along one outer edge, turn it around and go along the other. This piece was cut to 20 inches, 19 inches by 4 inches, so this is going to be a 1-inch strap. Throw everything on the ground. Throw it all on the ground. Okay, I'm gonna make a quick 2-inch center mark so I know where to fold into. Just going. Just make a few happy little marks. All right, so we're gonna unpeel the tape and fold in. Just want to hit right next to that 2-inch mark. You don't want to cover it completely, just right up next to it. And repeat with the other side. You don't want them to touch completely. You want to leave a very, very small opening. This helps the fold not be too thick etc. So you can see there's a little tiny channel between the two. And then you'll fold it over. I like to do a little bit, I'm gonna call it a beveled edge. You can see they're not overlapping right on top of each other. It's just under slightly. And I think that just creates a really nice feeling handle, especially with leather. So my stitch length is still set to 4.5. And I'm just gonna fold this nice and slow. So right next to that edge. You could add another piece of tape and fold it down, and then the tape already has it. It's basically like clips, but tape. And then when we get to the end, we're gonna leave our needle in and pivot, turn down, and sew. Turn and pivot and backstitch. Then we're going to trim all of our excess threads, and then I'm going to carefully trim these down so they're nice and even. Grab my scissors. You don't want to cut through your existing stitches. You just want to cut it so it's nice and even. And then if you're using leather, you can use edge coat to really make it a nice finished edge. You could use a strap end. I'm not going to use either. I don't think it's really necessary for this leather. But there is our strap. So you want that beveled piece to be underneath the bag. So the strap is gonna come around and down like this. Beveled edge under. And you could directly attach it to your D-rings, but I wanted to add a little extra length, a little more pizzazz. So I'm gonna use these 1-inch Swivel Clasps. These are from my website, moremeknow.com. Link below, who would have thought. But these can be ordered in 5 hardware colors, so lots to choose from. They're really strong, really sturdy. I'm just gonna fold it over and sew along. Ooh, baby, that looks amazing. My customer is gonna freak. I can't wait. Again, with this leather, I can just kind of singe the ends of my thread so that nothing comes undone and frays. All right, and then we're ready to add it to the bag, and the bag is done. Yeah, I did it. I made it. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So you can see that adds a little more class to the bag. The strap is a little fancier. You could also use some chain if you had some. I don't. Do you? I don't have any. Okay, I'm gonna straighten this out so you can see the finished product on an arm. Don't you love my ridiculous sewing shirt? It's amazing. Okay, so there is the bag on an arm. It's a really great size. You can make your strap longer if needed. You could add a crossbody strap. This seems to fit nicely under my arm. You can see that gorgeous hardware, gorgeous